He frantically looked around the back seat for something to soak up the 2 beers he had consumed earlier that evening, but found nothing. That is when a second idea formed in David's mind. He quickly and aggressively ripped out the crotch of his underwear and shoved the cloth deep into his mouth. As he began to chew, he felt a huge sense of defeat. There was no way he would be able to stomach that butt cloth he had partied in all.
Didn't that story just shake you to the core?
Would you like to hear more?
Then you've come to the right place. I'm Trevin.
And I'm Amanda.
And we're the hosts of Seriously Sinister, a true petty crime podcast.
Each week, we take a dramatic dive into real-life petty crimes.
They may make you laugh or cry, but they won't be like any other true crime stories you've heard.
Follow Seriously Sinister wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Hey friends, and welcome to another extra special episode of True Consequences. I'm your host, Eric Carter-Landin, and today I am joined by Mr. Raul Torrez, who is a Democratic candidate for Attorney General in New Mexico. Mr. Torrez, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Very glad to speak with you, and we're going to jump into this because I know there's a little bit of a time crunch here. So
sure.
To start off, tell my audience a little bit about yourself, your history, what got you interested in running for Attorney General. People may not know that you are currently the district attorney for Bernalillo County, but go ahead and introduce yourself to them.
Sure. So I'm an Albuquerque guy. I was born and raised here. And, my mom was a public school teacher. My dad's a career prosecutor. He's actually going to be retiring at the end of this week after 45 years serving as 39 as a prosecutor, as a federal prosecutor, and 6 as a state prosecutor. And so to a certain extent, as I often tell people, I kind of fell into one of the most depressing family businesses that you can ever end up in. And I grew up as a kid in very near just world of, law enforcement and going to court and hanging out with not just prosecutors, but people in the sort of the legal establishment. And I didn't really have a clear understanding of what my dad did until I got much older. And then I really started to see the impact that he had on people's lives, particularly on the lives of victims' families. And there've just been multiple occasions where I've seen people come up and, perfect strangers. They weren't strangers to him, but people that I didn't recognize. And it turned out that they were people that he had formed a bond with, prosecuting somebody that had murdered a member of their family or had harmed a member of their, one of their loved ones or friends or something like that. And so I really just started to see the incredible community impact that he had. And it wasn't something that I frankly knew I was going to do right away. I think like a lot of kids, maybe you try and move in a different direction. I left home and went away for school. I was very, very fortunate to be able to go. I got my undergraduate degree at Harvard and then went to the London School of Economics and then went to Stanford Law School, which basically means I know how to sign student loans and pile up a lot of debt. But fortunately for me, Stanford had a program for loan forgiveness if you did public interest. And so I came back home to New Mexico in 2005 and started working as a frontline prosecutor in Valencia County, New Mexico. And I did that, frankly, at the urging of my dad, who said, if you go out to a smaller rural community, you'll be able to do felony trial work faster. And that's exactly what happened. I ended up doing child abuse and sexual assault and violent crime work there. And then after a brief time, I went to work for the then Attorney General, Patsy Madrid. I stayed on and worked for Gary King. I was at what was then referred to as an internet crimes prosecutor. I did child solicitation cases. I prosecuted people for child pornography, and interstate sex trafficking, things like that. I ended up also working on sort of complex cases involving in custody deaths in smaller communities. I prosecuted 3 police officers in northern New Mexico for an in custody death, and just had this really broad experience inside the AG's office. And then I was very fortunate to be named as a White House Fellow by President Obama. I worked in the Department of Justice under Eric Holder, and then Deputy Attorney General of the United States for about a year. I took my young family across the country, and we spent a year in D.C. And then I came back to New Mexico after my year was up and took a job as a federal prosecutor, as an assistant U.S. attorney, and did that for a couple of years before opening up my own law practice and then eventually running for Bernalillo County District Attorney in 2016. I won and assumed office in 2017 and then was reelected without opposition in 2020. And so I've been managing what is effectively the largest law office in the state for about the last 5 years. And in terms of the size and scope and scale, it's kind of unprecedented. We handle usually somewhere in the order of 40% or so of the total criminal cases referred in the entire state. And that roughly translates into a little more than 100,000 criminal referrals in the last 5 years. So Whoa. It's a gargantuan operation. There are about 110, 115 lawyers in the building, nearly 220 or so full-time staff. It's got a substantial budget, and it has, it's basically a 24/7, 365 operation where we manage cases from multiple law enforcement agencies, misdemeanors all the way up to first-degree felonies. And we even have a number of our prosecutors that are cross-designated now as federal prosecutors, and so that we can take some of our more violent and dangerous offenders into federal court. So it's been quite an extraordinary journey for me, and a real sort of interesting, thing for me to do. My office sits about 4 blocks away from my elementary school. So it's very much one of those things where I feel this, deep connection to the community and deep connection to my father's legacy of public service and my mom's legacy of public service. And, it's a daunting job, and it's very challenging, but I love it and been engaged in it now for quite a long time.
That's awesome. If you get elected, what do you see as your main priorities going into 2023?
Yeah. Well, I think the number one thing we need to do is to rebuild the internal litigation capacity of the Attorney General's office. For a number of years now, we have increasingly relied on outside and oftentimes out of state law firms to handle the lion's share of environmental litigation, and natural resources litigation, consumer litigation. And I don't think that has been in the best interests of the citizens of the state. There's certainly times where litigation is too complex and the opposing party is so large that you would have to engage outside counsel. But we've become too reliant on that model. And what that means is that we don't have as many highly skilled and highly qualified in-house litigators the way that you would have in other states across the country. And that makes us largely dependent on these outside firms to step in and lead the charge on really consequential pieces of litigation that are going to have dramatic impacts on people's lives. And so the number one priority, I think, has to be to come in and rebuild that office and rebuild the capacity of the Attorney General's office, not just to sign on to briefs and accept cases that have been brought to you by other states or other law firms, but actually to initiate the work on behalf of the people of this state directly, and to, recover money or stop pollution or stop predatory corporations from taking advantage of people, especially vulnerable communities that don't have, the financial resources or the legal resources to defend themselves.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing. And I think it's important to have people who understand the struggles of the people of New Mexico fighting for them.
Yep.
So I think it's a good point. Can we talk a little bit about the Arnold tool and bail reform and where you stand? I know your office wouldn't be responsible for legislating any changes, but I was just curious where you stood on that.
Yeah, I've been a pretty, public advocate for what I think are some critical changes that need to be implemented in the way that we've engaged in bail reform in the state. We passed bail reform in 2016 overwhelmingly with the support of, I think, about 87% of the public. And there were two core promises that were made in the passage of that constitutional amendment. One was that we were going to enable judges to safely release low-end, nonviolent, mostly substance abuse offenders and people with minimal criminal histories back into the community so that they didn't have to stay in jail more often than not simply because they didn't have the resources to post a low bond. But at the same time, we paired that commitment with a commitment for judges to use their new discretion to keep the most violent and dangerous offenders detained before trial. And in my judgment, and looking at the data that we have inside our office and looking at some of the more recent high-profile cases that we've had in our jurisdiction, there have just been a number of people who have been released even though they have substantial criminal histories. They're accused of serious violent offenses. They're accused of weapons offenses and even, first-degree murder. They've been released back into the community, often on GPS monitoring without adequate supervision. And in sort of justifying or reaching that conclusion, a lot of times at least the courts here in Bernalillo County have been relying on what's called the Arnold risk assessment tool. That tool is in use in different jurisdictions across the country, but what many people in New Mexico don't realize is that it's in the implementation of that instrument that there's a high degree of variation from one state to the next. There's actually a separate set of questions that every jurisdiction can choose to adopt or not when they implement that tool that would supplement the recommendation that the judges get. And that supplemental framework was actually rejected by the New Mexico judiciary in the Second Judicial District. Our prosecutors argued that it should be included in the framework, but we were outvoted. And so we end up with, recommendations of people who stand accused of very serious violent crimes, like I said, including murder, that end up with a recommendation that they be released back into the public. One of the primary examples is somebody who we moved to detain last year. He was shooting out of a vehicle. He had distribution amounts of fentanyl. We made the argument that he was a danger. The judge disagreed with us, put him on GPS monitoring. He was wearing that GPS monitor when he actually committed a murder. He actually then followed that up with brandishing a shotgun and an elderly woman in the community and an armed robbery in the southeast part of town. Mm. And what was interesting is the first Arnold risk assessment tool judged him to be a low risk and recommended his release. And then even after he had committed that whole series of crimes and was now accused of first-degree murder, the Arnold tool once again recommended that person be released. Wow. And that's just one of the prime examples of a tool that, I think is well-intentioned, but it's just not grounded in reality. It's not grounded in common sense. Yeah. And to a certain extent, the judges have become dependent on that instrument to inform a lot of their decisions when frankly they shouldn't.
Absolutely. I think that's really helpful information. I appreciate you clarifying all of that because, this thing has kind of come up throughout my show, as you can imagine, as I've talked about cases like Victoria Martin's and several other cases where we see things like this happening, and the public are often confused, right? Because there's not a lot of understanding in the lay person's level of what all this consists of. So I appreciate you taking the time to explain that. One of the things that's really important to me, obviously, is the rate of child abuse and child abuse resulting in death in New Mexico. These offenses, we have a higher incidence of these incidences happening than most states and than the national average. What do you think the Attorney General's office can do to help with this crisis that we have here?
Well, to be honest with you, I think on the policy level, we need to have an Attorney General to start that understands the impact of early childhood trauma and adverse childhood experiences in a lot of these events. And, I get asked about crime and crime prevention a lot. And a lot of times people expect me to talk about heavier enforcement on guns or more treatment for narcotics. And all of those things are necessary and all of those things are important. But one of the things that I try to remind them is that most of the people we see in the criminal justice system reflect a failure to invest in destabilized and traumatized homes, and specifically homes with children 15 and 20 years ago. Most of the people that we see inside the criminal justice system, and I can tell you as somebody who spent, a good part of my adult life as a prosecutor in the courtrooms, we see a consistent story of the early childhood of most of the people who end up engaging in often very violent and dangerous acts. They themselves oftentimes were the victims of sexual assault, physical abuse, neglect, or, lived with an addicted parent, had an incarcerated parent. All of those things, if they occur early in someone's life while their brain is still developing and they're still sort of forming, can have a really traumatic impact on the way they regulate their emotional responses, their psychological responses, and it really does set them on a path that's much more likely to end up with contact in the criminal justice system. They have lower health outcomes, they have lower educational outcomes. And a lot of times what happens is those things happen and very little time, energy, or effort is paid to those families in crisis and those kids until they grow up and then become abusers themselves or become perpetrators themselves. And so my first argument to everyone is to think about the traumatized children right now today, right? In your neighborhood, in your community, in this state, there are families that have been hurt by substance abuse and, behavioral health disorders or incarceration or lots of other things. And if there are children in those homes that don't have a stable, reliable parent or adult in their lives, they are often going to be the ones that are gonna end up in this cycle that follows from one generation to the next. And so we have to really have somebody in the AG's office making it not just a health and educational argument about why we need to make those investments, but a public safety argument about the need for those investments. But separate and apart from that, the Attorney General's office has a critical role to play in setting the training standards for detectives, setting the training standards for first responders and other people who can identify the early warning signs of child abuse and trauma. There have been pretty startling revelations about not only understaffing at CYFD, but the lack of urgency that some in that agency have had towards families that have a very clearly established pattern of allegations of child abuse. And I think it's time for us to really take a careful look and see what's working inside CYFD and what is not. Because I can tell you that we oftentimes see, that agency have referrals about people where we have very serious and profound allegations of child abuse. And there's automatically this inclination towards reuniting that family. And that can place kids in a very dangerous situation. And so you need to have an attorney general who's got this perspective and has actually prosecuted child abuse, seen how the institutions work, see how law enforcement agencies are organized, to understand what kind of training and funding improvements need to be built into this infrastructure. Because if we don't do those things, we're just going to be, in a situation where we repeat the same problems of the past, and we've got to get out of it.
Yeah, I feel like we've been there for decades here in New Mexico.
Yeah.
With regards to child abuse, with regards to overcrowding of jails and the solutions that we come up with, which always end up backfiring on us. So we have a history of not really learning from the past here. And I think that you're spot on with regards to childhood trauma. It's something that I've talked about on my show over and over again. As somebody who's experienced significant childhood trauma, I was fortunate to have people around me to help me to overcome some of that trauma and to make my life better in spite of it. But it's important to know that, crime is just a symptom of a lot of other problems that we have. poverty, education challenges, and then you have childhood trauma thrown into that as well. Child abuse, substance abuse, all of those things contribute to crime. Crime can't just be solved by locking everybody up. We have to fix the actual problem first.
Yeah. Well, they did a study recently in Bernalillo County. Well, it's a few years old now, but they looked at the early childhood trauma and the ACEs score, Adverse Childhood Experiences score. And they found that 75% of the boys and 87% of the girls in juvenile detention had 5 or more ACEs by the time they were detained, and nearly 10 CYFD referrals before they were actually taken into custody on a criminal charge themselves. And what that tells you is that we just have this extraordinarily high rate of trauma in a pretty small population. And if we focus more of our energy and effort on those kids, then 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, we would see substantially less crime. We would see substantially less involvement in the criminal justice system. And we also we can save lots of money if we put more into rehabilitation once they get out. There was a program that followed those kids out after they were incarcerated, enrolled them, and got them educational, support and healthcare support. And what we saw is a drop in the recidivism rate. Sure. And so, a pretty startling difference in the kids that got no services when they left versus the kids that got a ton of services. And so we were not only saving lives, we were saving money, and we were improving the community. And so what we're doing now in the DA's office is, rather than wait for kids to end up in the juvenile system, we're actually referring the children of incarcerated adults, people that we prosecute in this office. We are actually trying to get them referred for services on the front end so they don't end up in the juvenile system, so they don't end up in the criminal justice system at all. And so it's that kind of, innovative policy work that really, I think, brings a lot of life to what is otherwise a pretty difficult job.
So something that recently came across my desk was a study showing that New Mexico had the most incidences of missing and murdered indigenous people in the country. And then Bernalillo County, of course, being one of the higher areas in the state that has those as well. Is there anything that you think the Attorney General's office can do to help clear up some of the red tape associated with helping the tribes handle these missing cases, but also, respecting their sovereignty?
Yeah, no, this is one of those silent epidemics that occurs in this country, and frankly, it's just a reflection of the fact that certain communities don't get seen the way other communities do, and it's long past time for the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women to really get the attention that it deserves. Native women, I think, are something on the order of 10 times more likely to die by homicide than any other group in the country. I mean, it's just astonishing, the rate of violent crime there. And one of the things that we have endeavored to do, we actually started the first dedicated investigative unit that focuses exclusively on missing and murdered Indigenous women here in the DA's office. And we not only actively work on specific cases, we helped recover a young girl who was taken from New Mexico and actually recovered in Chicago. But we do a higher level of work with our tribal partners and try to integrate the information sharing and the information architecture that sits beneath all of these law enforcement agencies. Most people don't realize that we have all these different agencies that sit side by side, but they don't actually naturally share information from one sheriff's department to this police department to the federal law enforcement. They all sit siloed in these separate spaces. And so our office has invested heavily in technology improvements. We've got a partnership with New Mexico Tech and a partnership with Sandia National Labs. And we actually have in-house coders in the building. And what they do is they're working on developing a platform that will enable us to share information across all of these different siloed data systems in real time. And the reason that's so important is that if someone disappears in Crown Point and maybe she's seen by a police officer in Santa Fe and then disappears but is seen again by a police officer in Albuquerque, we can then start connecting the dots between, this is the vehicle she was seen in these 3 locations, or this person was seen in this location and we know that that person has a residence over here. And if you share information in real time, that's actually the key, the most essential ingredient in prevention and solving some of these cases at the outset, is to deliver real-time accurate information across multiple jurisdictions at the same time. We're hampered by the fact that, in this space, we have competing agencies, local agencies, tribal agencies, and federal agencies that sometimes don't have a clear, understanding of their boundaries or how they're supposed to push or receive information from their partner agencies. But if we build this infrastructure, we should be in a position to share information in real time and really start to solve these cases at a much higher rate.
That sounds very promising, and I hope that that's something that can happen sooner than later.
Yeah.
Because it's long overdue. Okay, so one more question, and then we'll wrap up with your closing thoughts here. What's your position on people who are currently incarcerated for marijuana-related offenses, knowing that it's now legal in the state?
Well, look, we've got a whole system in place. We're actually we get a record of prior convictions for people that are looking to have their records expunged. I'm not aware of anyone in our jurisdiction that's incarcerated simply on a marijuana charge. And we have actually taken the position of for a while now, not moving forward with any of those cases even before legalization happened. But I think, prosecutors and police officers, at least in my jurisdiction, are so focused on methamphetamine, fentanyl, heroin, and things like that, I don't actually know how many resources have been dedicated to marijuana, even in the years before legalization really happened. And I don't imagine that that's going to be a problem. I haven't seen much resistance, frankly, inside law enforcement to, moving away and actually rethinking a lot of what we do on the drug enforcement side. I can tell you our federal counterparts and our counterparts in the police department are much more worried about gun violence. Sure. And that's where our heavy emphasis is on.
You did mention a little bit about heroin, and I don't know if you can give me a few seconds about the opioid crisis and the fentanyl crisis here in New Mexico and how that contributes to crime and what the AG's office can do to support addressing that.
I think obviously we've had a real problem lately with fentanyl making it into the illicit market. It's leading to a rise or rising percentage of our overdose deaths here in the state. Heroin has been, a problem in New Mexico for generations. I will tell you that the thing that probably impacts us the most is methamphetamine.
Any final thoughts you want to give my listeners about, your campaign, about voting, anything that you want to close out with here for my listeners?
Well, first I just want to, thank you for taking the time and taking an interest in the race. I think it's critically important. I think, we are facing sort of unprecedented challenges in New Mexico right now, but across the whole country. We've got environmental issues, consumer protection issues, and obviously public safety and criminal justice issues that need very serious reflection and deliberation. And I think in terms of trying to figure out who is best able to lead in that effort, the one thing I always ask people to think about is if you were picking an attorney for your family, if you were going to pick someone because someone might lose custody of their children, or they might lose their business, or someone that they love is charged with a crime, and you had to go about making a determination of who would be the best attorney to represent my family, my loved one, what are the qualities you would look for? And if you think about it in that way, you almost certainly would look for somebody who has real world experience, who has a demonstrated track record, and somebody who can tell you, I've done this work. This is something that I've dedicated myself to. And I think if people reflect on that and use the same framework to think about the choice for attorney general, and they are guided by, valuing experience and valuing somebody who's actually put themselves out there for years and years in service to the community, then I hope that they will come to the conclusion that I'm the best candidate for for that job. And only, the only thing I can offer people is a commitment to keep using everything that I have to try and serve my home and serve my state and make this the best place that it can possibly be for all of us to live in.
That was very well said. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to chat with me, to chat with my listeners. And thank you again, Mr. Torrez. If you want to learn more, if my audience wants to learn more, do you have a website or something that people...
Yeah, it's very complicated. It's RaulTorrez.com.
There you go. Raul Torrez, Torrez with a Z.com.
With a Z.
And thank you all for listening. I'm your host, Eric Carter-Landin, and stay safe, New Mexico.